know me. So I'm Jonathan Rhodes. I'm based in the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences. I work largely on spatial conservation planning problems. I'm particularly interested in how we manage complex human-dominated landscapes, and particularly how we do that under uncertainty. And I do a lot of work on sort of conservation planning, but also policy analysis. Work a lot with governments on trying to solve their conservation problems with some success, but some failures too, of course. So today I'm going to talk about really just it's a perspective article that we published earlier on in the year, really around flexibility in conservation, particularly focused around climate change. I'm just going to talk about that one paper, and I guess it probably raises more questions than answers, but it's really supposed to sort of provoke some thinking about flexibility in conservation, particularly in the climate change space. Okay, so the paper was published in One Earth, and it was a collaboration between these wonderful people, and something that we'd been talking about for a long time, about uncertainty and flexibility, and how we might deal with the uncertainty using flexible approaches. And I guess we probably started talking about it about 5 years ago or something, and never did anything with it. And we thought we should probably write something, so we did. And it was funded from various sources of ARC funding that allow us to come together and discuss some of the stuff that went into the paper. So that's who I worked with. So it's not just my work; it's all of their work as well. So okay. So in terms of the outline of the talk, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the motivation, the problem we were trying to think about, and I guess I'm focusing the talk around, well, the talk is sort of focused around climate adaptation and uncertainty and climate risk, but actually it applies really to any sorts of uncertainty we might have in conservation, where we're trying to make decisions in an uncertain world. So, but it's sort of focused around climate risk. And then I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about climate risk and conservation decision-making, some of the approaches we use for dealing with risk and uncertainty, particularly in the climate change space. And then I'm going to sort of propose a way of thinking about flexibility and it's sort of a bit of a conceptual framework about types of flexibility we might use that's perhaps broader than that's typically addressed in the literature to date. I'll talk a little bit about costs and benefits, and it's not really a focus of the work, but I think we do touch on some of the costs and benefits, and then a little bit on challenges and moving forward, and some of the issues that we need to think about and address, and some of the challenges. Okay. All right. Okay. So as I said, this is really about uncertainty and how we use flexible approaches to deal with uncertainty. And I guess there's uncertainty everywhere, right? And uncertain things happen, but that's particularly the case in the climate space. And I guess one type of uncertainty that we deal with is just stuff we just don't know about, and relationships between climate and biodiversity, or relationships between climate and socio-ecological systems. And so often these types of uncertainties are potentially reducible by doing research and collecting data. But if you look at the sort of climate change literature and biodiversity conservation and climate change literature, there's lots of examples of, whoops, that was a bit quick, examples of sort of unexpected results of the impact of climate change. So, impacts on seasonality, unexpected impacts of seasonality that we then discover, okay? Impacts on soil bacteria, impacts on alpine vegetation, shifts in alpine vegetation, unexpected changes in community structure. And all these things are really relevant for conservation. They're the impacts on biodiversity that drive the types of decisions we might take, or the types of actions that we might take. There's also uncertainty about the effectiveness of our actions that some of these depend on. So I think if you look at the literature, there are things we find out that are unexpected that might change our conservation decisions. So that's one form of uncertainty, and we can, in theory, we can do research and we can collect data and learn about these things and resolve that uncertainty. And often that uncertainty get resolved over long periods of time, right? It might take decades and so on to resolve that uncertainty. So that's one type of uncertainty that we need to deal with, and affects the types of decisions we might take, but also the effectiveness of our actions. The other types of uncertainties are those things that happen quickly, right? So really uncertainties, these are stochastic events that happen quickly, really hard to predict. Often we know they're coming, but we don't know when, we don't know how big, but they're still uncertainties. And these are often irreducible uncertainties. We often can't, you know, maybe in theory we could learn and predict these things better, but they're hard to predict, and we often can't reduce them through more data or more research. So, you know, examples of extreme events such as fire, flood, drought, and so on. And often in conservation, we have to respond quickly to those types of uncertainties. There's also evidence for things like threshold effects of climate, so species assemblages or ecosystem changing rapidly in response to climate change. So this paper by Trizos, actually I won't point, just the paper on your left there, showing the areas at risk where species assemblages, greater than 20% of species assemblages are at high risk of very abrupt exposure to climate change outside their species envelope. So these potentially areas where you might get these large assemblage changes over a very quick period of time for under climate change. And again, it's difficult to plan for these things, right? We can't, they're hard to predict. And so, but we need strategies for dealing with them. Okay, so how do we deal with these types of things? You know, and I'm going to talk mostly about, it's mainly around the conservation planning type literature and methods for dealing with uncertainties. And many of you in the room would be familiar with some of these approaches and have worked on them. And there's really, I guess, two types of approaches. One is a static approach for trying to manage uncertainty, and one is a dynamic approach for managing uncertainty. And so if we first look at that sort of static approach, it's really a sort of risk spreading approach. And often we think about it as a one-off decision. You're trying to invest in, hello? Someone's got their, not muted, I think. One-off decisions, or it could be a series of decisions through time, but those decisions are fixed. Okay, we're just going to plan now, and we're going to say, you know, we're going to plan out these decisions over time. So it's really a static approach. And really the goal is to find actions that minimize the risk, and or to meet some acceptable level of risk. Okay, and often we're interested in trading off risk and return. Often you almost always find that as you want to reduce risk, you have to give up conservation benefits or return. Okay, so and approaches for doing this sort of analysis, things like modern portfolio theory from finance, drawn from finance, or portfolio theory for managing assets, financial assets, robust optimization, info gap decision theory, and people in this room have worked with those. This is an example from Rebecca Runting's, looking at this is for you online, the figure on the left, showing risk on the x-axis, conservation returns on the right axis for managing or protecting coastal wetlands, and that just shows the risk return trade-off and the different strategies you find. So often you find that the strategy is quite different for low risk strategies compared to high risk strategies. And various people here have worked with modern portfolio theory. Frankie Cho has been working at the moment. Maybe there's others, maybe Jeff, I don't know. But anyway, I think quite a few people have done some really good work in CBCS on trying to think about how we plan for risk using those sorts of approaches. But that's not really what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm going to talk more about dynamic approaches. And I'm not really going to talk about optimization and so on, and how we do, what are the tools for doing it, but just we're going to think more conceptually about flexibility. But the sort of dynamic approach is relevant here for providing the context. And so this is a quite different approach, and it's really about, rather than saying we've got a static decision to make and we're just going to make a decision now, and then we're just going to sit and wait and see what happens, it's been being nimble and be able to adapt through time. Okay, so and often, well, almost always decisions are made through time in response to new information. Okay, but we don't predetermine what those decisions are. Okay, we know we're going to have to adapt and we're going to have to change our decisions. So we might want to change where we invest conservation resources or move protected areas, for instance, those types of decisions. And so, typical approaches in the conservation literature, adaptive management. Many of you will be familiar with adaptive management. I'll come back to that in a moment. Real options analysis, sort of stolen from finance again, thinking about when to invest in conservation or other investments. And then in the sort of climate adaptation literature, these sort of dynamic adaptation, dynamic adaptive pathways have been quite popular in thinking about, well, how do you keep your options open now to be able to adapt in the future? And so this figure on the left is just a diagrammatic representation of these actions you can take now. And we don't want to be in actions that lock us into one particular pathway. We want to keep our options open. And so that's been quite popular in that sort of climate adaptation literature. I don't think it's been taken up so much in the conservation literature, but it's probably got a lot of things in similar, well, it's similar to sort of adaptive management, I guess. I guess the key thing with these sorts of approaches, and there's often ignored in the adaptive management literature, is it requires the flexibility to be able to adapt through time. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. If we're going to take these adaptive approaches, and I'm not suggesting either the adaptive or the dynamic approaches is better. I think it depends on the context, and we'll talk about costs and benefits shortly. But we do have to have flexibility to be able to adapt through time if that's the approach you want to take. And so that requires thinking about that now at the front in the planning stage. Okay. All right. So, sorry, can we move that? Is that possible? Or I think you can. Or do you not want to touch it? It's okay if you don't want to touch it. Sorry, just trying to. Actually, don't worry. It says, no, don't touch it. It's all right. We'll muck it up. We'll muck it up. It says adaptive for those in the room. It's okay for you online, I think. But, okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk a bit about flexibility and adaptive management, and mainly I'll focus on adaptive management because I think in conservation and ecological literature, that's been, I guess, probably the predominant approach in thinking about dynamic approaches to conservation. And I'm going to sort of try and link that to flexibility. So first of all, I guess, defining flexibility, because I haven't defined it yet. And so we define flexibility as the ability to rapidly halt, start, modify, or switch strategies or actions in the future. So I guess the key thing there is that it's not just about action, it's actually strategy. So our approach to conservation might need to be adaptive too. It's not just about switching actions necessarily. And adaptive management is this on the left here. So this is an example. So I guess most of you are probably familiar with adaptive management, but really it's a decision process for planning actions that you then monitor and then learn about, and then you modify your actions subsequently based on what you learn, on what information you learn. And there's generally two types of adaptive management. One's known as passive adaptive management, where you basically try and make the best decisions you can and learn as a consequence of that, and passively as a consequence of that. Or active adaptive management, where you specifically design interventions to learn about the system you're interested in and the effectiveness of that management action. So they're subtly different. So that's sort of adaptive management. But I guess for just looking at there's some literature on looking at the ability to be flexible in adaptive management, how much that might benefit you. But it's that sort of literature is largely silent on how do you achieve flexibility, and how do you ensure from the start you can actually switch and adapt actions over time, or shift and adapt strategies or decision-making processes over time. It doesn't really touch on that at all. And we also know that flexibility can be low. Okay, so flexibility is often constrained by things like governance and legal constraints, which are on purpose designed to be stable and not really allow too much change, okay? And so this just example on the left here by Fishman and Rule, just an assessment, it was really a review of US agencies and the governance and legal arrangements around US agencies. And they found that really those governance and legal arrangements really restricted the flexibility that they needed to really apply active adaptive management. So I think there's some good examples that show that, you know, there are these constraints on flexibility. And if we really want to truly be adaptive, then we need to ensure that we have this flexibility. Okay, so our paper is really about, well, what are the types of flexibility we might need, and how do we think more strategically about flexibility? Okay, so and you can't see that domain. I think it says just like insurance for those in the room. I think there is a way of getting rid of it, but that's okay. Just like insurance, investment in flexibility needs to be a strategic upfront decision. And sort of taking some sort of those ideas from those adaptive pathways type ideas, you really need to make strategic decisions now that ensure that in the future, when you have to modify your conservation activities or the way you make decisions or the stakeholders you interact with, then you're in a position to do that and be nimble to adapt. So I guess we see it as it needs to be a strategic upfront decision about, you know, how flexible do you want to be? So you need to, it's part of the decision-making process. First of all, how flexible you want to be, and then what are the risks you want to sort of insure yourself against with these flexible strategies, and what does that tell you about the type of flexibility you might need? And I'm not saying people don't think about this. Just my experience from I work mostly with governments. My sense is they don't think about these things necessarily up front. And obviously organizations do think about risk and risk assessment, but it's not clear that it's really embedded within conservation planning as such. So I guess we wanted to sort of, you know, try and pull this apart a little bit and think about, well, how might you start thinking more strategically about flexibility beyond, you know, just, well, we just need to be able to switch locations for reserves, okay, which is often, you know, there's lots of papers looking at, you know, moving reserves around and what's the benefit of that. Okay, but obviously that is part of it potentially. Okay, all right. So I guess the first thing we sort of do is think about the types of risks. You know, I think we need to start thinking about the types of risks to start with within the decision-making process. So what I've got here is really just a standard structured decision-making process, acknowledging that climate risk and uncertainty, and you can replace this with any uncertainty, doesn't have to be just climate risk, but let's focus on climate for now, and acknowledging that, you know, you can get these rapid sort of extreme events, stochastic events that muck up our conservation plans, but also we get these sort of long-term average changes that we might learn about over time, and they're different types of uncertainties, and they might influence how quickly we need to respond. And so, yeah, standard. So we take this standard structured decision-making process where, and I guess most of you would be familiar with this, and you know, there's various versions of this, but we pick this one where you really, you know, the start is really identifying the problem. You're going to define your conservation or decision-making context and objectives. You then identify your actions and constraints of what are the set of actions, what are the constraints you're under. You would evaluate the consequences of each of those, and maybe trade-offs, and then you would select the actions you want to choose, and then you implement, monitor, and then you reevaluate. Okay, so it's like an adaptive management cycle. So, you know, if you look at, you know, typical sort of standard conservation planning type structured approach. Okay, and then we can think about, well, what are the types of risks that might occur due to climate change? And I got 4 here, and I guess that you could probably think about this more broadly, and there's probably a whole range of other types of risks that might occur. And I'm thinking about these risks in terms of the decisions you make here, and how does this affect the decision-making process and the outcomes? Okay. So if we look at the 4, so one is just, you can misspecify the conservation problem, right? So there's uncertainty about predictions of climate effects. you might just miss the fact that you just could be wrong, that actually there's going to be a massive climate impact on this species. You didn't think there was going to be, so you didn't do anything, you just got it wrong, right? You just missed the problem. Okay, that's one risk that could occur. Another risk is in terms of misspecifying the conservation problem, is that you might misspecify the objectives, or you might have talked to the wrong stakeholders and you're not uncertain about those objectives, or those objectives might change through time. Climate change might drive social change and economic change that then changes stakeholders' objectives, and we have this, this change through time, and if we don't capture that change, then we're probably likely to get our conservation outcomes are probably going to be inferior. Okay. So that's one type of risk. Another type of risk is we just get constrained action choices. So it may be that in the future, our action choices are constrained by resource constraints. For instance, there may be financial or political reasons why, that we have constrained action choice in the future. Maybe people would realize or decide that it's only carbon we care about, so who cares about biodiversity? Okay. But there may be opportunities too, right? So there could be opportunities that come up in the future. So I'm sort of thinking about downside risk, the things that can go wrong, but I'm conscious that we should also think about upside as well. There may be opportunities like abandoned agricultural land that we might not have thought might have been abandoned, but they might provide an unexpected opportunity in the future. So that's second sort of type of risk. There's also incorrect action choices. We just get it wrong, right? We think a certain action is going to work, like providing drinkers to koalas or something, and in drought, and we find it just doesn't work. Okay, we just get it wrong. We've invested a whole lot of money, but then we need to switch. Okay, so there's incorrect action choices, but there may be also upsides as well. We might find that some strategies work a lot better than we thought. Okay, but we might want to invest more in it. Okay. And then there's a need for rapid responses. So climate change may increase the frequencies of these extreme events and extreme climate events like fire, drought, and so on. And so it may increase the need to respond rapidly. So in terms of flexibility, do we have the ability to be able to respond rapidly when those events occur? And what you can do, actually, you can map these things onto these risks onto the decision-making process. So misspecification of the conservation problem really applies to problem identification and defining the context and objectives. We can map constrained action choices onto, when we're identifying the set of actions now and in the future, that influences that part of the decision-making process. Incorrect action choices affects the evaluation step. And the trade-offs and the actions we select. And then we went forward one more. Oops, sorry. How do I get back? Okay, and then those need for rapid responses really applies to that implementation and monitoring step. Can we implement a change in action rapidly, and can we monitor and see the effect and so on? So we can map these onto the decision-making process, and by doing that, it helps us to if we know something about the risks that might be present, can help us to diagnose the component of the decision-making process that we may need to address in terms of being more flexible about to try and reduce these risks in the future. Okay. So then we propose 3 types of flexibility, and the idea of these is really to think more broadly than just this action choice set of switching actions, which is quite common in the literature. And we identify 3 types of flexibility that might be important. One is procedural flexibility, one is resource flexibility, and one is action flexibility. And the idea being here is, can we identify the links of, if we can identify the risks, what part of the decision-making process is impacted by those risks, and then by looking at these 3 types of flexibility, can we then link those to the decision-making process to identify appropriate flexibility approaches? So by procedural flexibility, I'll look into these, I'll go into these in a little bit more detail in a moment, but it's really about the decision-making process. And although that affects the whole decision-making process, predominantly probably affects more that sort of problem identification of objectives and so on, and the implementation stuff. So it's those procedures that actually make the decision work. Resource flexibility is really about the constraints. And then action flexibility is about how flexible are we in changing actions. And I guess both those really relate to that part of the decision-making process where we're identifying actions and finding the best outcome. So by thinking about it this way, I think we can then think about trying to link the risks to the actual flexible strategy you might employ. So that if you're trying to think about this strategically from the start, you can start to diagnose the types of flexibility you might want to invest in. Okay, so as insurance essentially for climate risks. Okay, let's dig into each of these a little bit more. Okay, so procedural flexibility is really about the ability to modify the conservator's decision process itself. So can we actually look at the decision process itself? You know, it may be which stakeholders we engage with, it may be how do we set objectives, it may be how do we respond to new information. But it's really about that decision-making process itself and being adaptive. And so some of the sort of frameworks we can think about to help us do that are things like adaptive governance and legal frameworks. So adaptive governance really takes sort of governance ideas, and rather than, which are typically, I guess, designed for stability, and building a bit more latitude into those governance arrangements to allow flexibility to change processes and so on. And a particular component of that is being a learning organization. So, and by learning organization, I really mean a culture of learning in an organization, so that as new information becomes available, there's a culture of learning from that and adapting your governance or decision-making processes. So I think that's key to being adaptive here. And so the relevant risks, I think, if we go back to that decision-making, those decision-making steps, we can think about, well, what are the relevant risks here that we might address with this sort of approach? Well, I guess those misspecification of the problem and things like objectives and so on might be appropriate to address with more procedural flexibility. The need for responding rapidly. Do we need governance structures in our organizations to be able to respond rapidly to fire and so on? And how do we plan for that right from the start? And then I guess I mentioned learning down there. Is there a culture of not learning from information? Is there a pathway from learning to change in the process? And so addressing that risk as well. So that's procedural flexibility. And I've sort of got some examples. I've got some examples. Hang on, here we go. So this is just an example we use in the paper. Is a nice example from Lake Biwa in Japan, and it's Japan's largest lake, and it's got high biodiversity value, but it also has invasive aquatic weeds. This is just a picture of them removing water primrose, and that weed in particular spreads stochastically. It spreads through, depends on meteorological conditions, climate, spreads through stochastic events like flooding and so on. Really hard to predict where it spreads to. Really expensive to remove. You need big machines like this. And so they set up I think in 2013, set up a council for the management of invasive aquatic weeds within Lake Biwa, which has many of the characteristics of adaptive governance, and particularly engagement and learning from stakeholders and being able to respond rapidly and proactively rather than retrospectively. And so have developed that culture of organizational learning as well, to adapt through learning through time. So some of these examples not necessarily about climate change, but given the impacts of climate on spread of this weeds, it could also be applied to climate challenges as well. So that's procedural flexibility. Okay, resource flexibility. So we define resource flexibility as the ability to relax resource constraints through time to essentially expand the range of options in this future. So if you think that resource constraints in the future might be a risk, how do you build flexibility into your organizational planning approaches to ensure that you have that flexibility to have the resources to expand the range of options? These could be financial or capacity constraints, and they can involve things like delayed decision making, so delayed investments. You could have just delay your investment. So this is a paper by Gwen Iacona on the left here showing, and this was some work Gwen did looking at the trade-off between funding, which is the green blob here, and if you keep that funding in financial investments that grows over time, and the benefit of waiting to invest. And they find that the optimal strategy, both in the Atlantic forest and Mount Lofty ranges, is to wait, okay? Because the trade-off, the benefit you get from the growth in those resources over time provides you with the flexibility to do more in the future. Now, that paper's not specifically about flexibility, but shows some of the ideas around delaying decisions to allow you to do more in the future. Things like allowing budget carryovers, reallocating resources amongst activities, and having this flexibility. So a lot of that will depend on the right governance arrangements, of course. But I think the point here is actually trying to relieve risks in potentially perceived risks or real risks around the constraints on resources, particularly financial resources. And so, this can help address risks such as constrained action choices and missed future opportunities by allowing more resources to adapt into the future. Good example of this is the Nature Conservancy's internal revolving loan fund. So the Nature Conservancy has a federated structure in the US, and they invest, like lots of other land trusts, in private land purchases. And so within this federated structure, the land trusts sit within state chapters. And as with all private land conservation, opportunities come up to purchase properties in an unpredictable way, right? Opportunities come up and then you need to respond, okay? So it's really opportunistic because not everyone's selling their properties. And so it's an example of this sort of risk of, in this case, it's looking for opportunities, but then they have this internal revolving loan fund where chapters can apply to the federal part of TNC for a loan for a purchase if they're constrained by finances. And so that movement of resources across the organization allows them to respond rapidly and be less constrained by those resource constraints. That's an example of this sort of financial flexibility that allows resource constraints or financial constraints to be minimized. And so things like trusts and so on could allow this to happen for future climate risks. Okay, so intergenerational trusts and so on. Press it again. Okay, and then the final one is action flexibility. So we define this as the ability to reverse or change an existing action. And I guess the key thing with this is that it's probably action and ecosystem dependent. So for example, protected areas or sort of standard government protected areas, probably highly inflexible about moving them around. But what the management you can do in those protected areas is probably highly flexible, because you can change management actions very easily. If you contrast to things like payment for ecosystem services, where you invest those payments for ecosystem services may be very flexible and you can move that around through time, but your control over the management action is far less flexible. Okay. Probably also ecosystem dependent as well. So protected areas in marine systems might be much easier to move around than say on terrestrial areas, just because the land rights on terrestrial areas are much more rigid and legally defined. They restrict flexibility. So I think, in thinking about action flexibility, if flexibility is important for your conservation organization, your conservation plan, because you've identified these future risks, then you don't really want to be necessarily entirely invested in in actions that are likely to be highly inflexible in the future. So this is just an example here on the left of pop-up park in Melbourne, these things that pop up for take advantage of in urban areas, take advantage of open spaces that allow for some biodiversity values to be present for a period of time and found to be highly variable. And so this can help address things like incorrect action choices, risks of incorrect action choices, constrained action choices in the future. So if we can if we have the ability to invest in other types of actions in the future, that can resolve that constraint, but also address missed opportunities as well. Okay. And so, and a good example of this is this is like an advert for TNC, isn't it, right? I know people worked on bird return stuff. I know Ali talked about it a couple of weeks ago. So the bird returns, TNC's bird returns basically in California pays, this is for migratory birds, pays landholders through a reverse auction to flood their fields at certain times. And that's driven by crowdsourced data, bird observations and satellite driven data and data on weather and so on. And so they can pinpoint where they want to invest. So it's highly flexible and highly dynamic. They have a good learning process. And so it's a really good example of a dynamic, truly sort of dynamic conservation approach, because where they invest is not predetermined from year to year. Again, could be adapted for longer term climate type problems as well. Okay, all right, I'm going to wrap up in a sec. So that was sort of, so I guess that's our sort of framework and thinking. It's the idea really of those three categories is, and the linking with the decision, the structured decision-making process that provides a means to then link risks to potential solutions for flexibility. But let's talk about costs and benefits. So I guess our aim is not really to push flexibility. It's really about, if you need flexibility, how might you think about doing it and why? But I think any organization really has to weigh up the costs and benefits of doing, a sort of static permanent approach versus the flexible approach. So we can think about some of the benefits. Obviously, I've talked about some of them already. Ability to respond rapidly to new situations, to either limit poor conservation outcomes or take advantage of new opportunities that you weren't aware of. Keeping options open allows you broader range of options. And I think it can facilitate new strategies as new information becomes available. Okay, so new opportunities can arise. However, there are costs. So investing in flexibility doesn't come free, right? So if you need to invest in new governance structures to allow a more flexible approach, that's not going to be free. There's an upfront cost. We may need to take a lower expected conservation benefit to allow us to have greater flexibility in the future. So there's certainly costs. There may also be ongoing transaction costs. Every time you change a decision, there's a transaction cost. It may be legal transaction costs, it may be other costs. And then the thing that always comes up when people say, oh, you shouldn't be flexible, is that the concern that it erodes conservation values. And if it's not permanent, it's going to erode conservation values. And that certainly is a risk, and that needs to be taken into account. And so, you have things like the protected area degazetting and downgrading tracker that tracks, concerns, downgrading of protected areas. Interesting though, if you look at I think less than 2% of those protected area downgrades or degazetting, less than 2% are for strategic regions. So clearly these degazetments are not being used strategically. They could potentially be. So, but that's the I think that risk of erosion of conservation values is a risk you need to take into account, as well as the upside risks. So, so I don't provide any solutions to costs and benefits, but I think I think we need better approaches to try and estimate these costs and benefits so you can make strategic decisions. And that's, I guess, that's one of the challenges, challenges of moving forward. I guess, talking about permanence, I guess permanence really has a considerable inertia in conservation. But I think it's important to also think about, well, have the conversation around, well, what's the value of flexibility as well? And so, and if we are going to think more strategically about permanence versus more flexible approaches, and think about that strategically, then it's going to mean people needing to do something different and different way of thinking about the problem. And in some cases, a more permanent approach might be best, and in some cases, more flexible approaches. Chances are it's probably combinations of the both. A lot of conservation is driven by short-term funding cycles, political and other funding cycles. So by making an investment in flexibility, you're making an investment it's a short-term cost for a long-term gain. Okay, it's always hard to do that. And I guess it has intergenerational equity issues. Should we be paying now large upfront costs for benefits a long time in the future? Okay. And as I said, I think developing ways to better measure these costs and benefits across the broad suite of flexible options we have is essential really if we want to start thinking more strategically about these things. So which we don't do, but I think it needs to be something that I think there's an opportunity there to start thinking more broadly and thinking, well, how do we estimate the costs and benefits of these investments in flexibility and keeping options open versus not. Okay, I was going to leave it there. Thank you.